It was a cold, quiet night, the kind that makes you question every creak in your house. My shift had just ended at the precinct, and I was looking forward to a beer and a late-night rerun of some show I wouldn't remember the next day. I was halfway through my first sip when my work phone buzzed. A new call came in from dispatch, an anonymous tip about strange activity at an abandoned property on Ridgewood Avenue. "You're kidding me," I muttered to myself, but curiosity got the better of me. Ridgewood had a reputation, a century-old house that no one dared to enter after dark. People whispered about voices coming from the basement, sightings of shadows that moved on their own. By the time I pulled up, the house loomed like a monster in the fog. The windows were shattered, their jagged edges like fangs, and the door hung slightly ajar, as though waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to step inside. I radioed in my position, but the static response was eerie, like a whisper just out of reach. As I entered, flashlight cutting through the dark, I caught a smell that made my stomach churn, something between mildew and decayed meat. My boots crunched on broken glass as I moved through the foyer, its wallpaper peeling like dead skin. A staircase spiraled up to a second floor, but it was the muffled sound from below that froze me in place. A voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help me," it whimpered. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint but chillingly clear. "Help me?" it repeated, cracking with desperation. I scanned the room with my flashlight. The beams swept over broken furniture, crumpled beer cans, and graffiti-scrawled walls, but there was no sign of anyone. The voice came again, this time louder, and it was unmistakably coming from the basement. Every instinct told me to call for backup. But the thing is, when you're on the job long enough, there's this sense of duty that overrides common sense. If someone was down there, I couldn't just leave them. With my heart pounding, I gripped my flashlight tighter and made my way toward the basement door. It creaked open slowly, revealing a staircase that plunged into darkness. The smell intensified, so thick it felt like it clung to my skin. The air down there was colder, damp and heavy. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, as though the sound bounced off walls that weren't quite real. Halfway down, my flashlight flickered. I tapped it with my palm, the beam stabilizing. That's when I saw it. At the base of the stairs, just barely visible, was a figure crouched in the corner. "Hey!" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is the police. Are you hurt?" The figure didn't respond. It was hunched, shoulders shaking, as if crying. My stomach turned as I descended the last few steps, my other hand instinctively reaching for my holstered weapon. "Ma'am? Sir?" I tried again, and then the figure moved. Slowly, unnaturally, it turned its head toward me. The figure's head twisted at an unnatural angle, far more than any human neck should allow. My flashlight illuminated its face, a pale, gaunt mask with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and yet no sound came out. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. I couldn't look away as it started to rise, its movements jerky and mechanical, like a marionette on tangled strings. The voice came again, but this time it was different. Raspy, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "Help me, stay." I snapped out of my trance and instinctively drew my gun, leveling it at the figure. "Stop! Don't move!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the cold, stone walls. But it didn't stop. It took one slow, deliberate step toward me, then another. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if studying me. My flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard something behind me, a low, guttural growl. I spun around, my light cutting through the blackness, but there was nothing there. When I turned back, the figure was gone. The basement was silent now, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, something in the air, a pressure that pressed down on my chest like a weight. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deeper in the basement. I hadn't seen any doors down here, but the sound was undeniable. Against my better judgment, I followed it, my flashlight beam jittering as my hand shook. The footsteps led me to a wall at the far end of the basement. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the stone. My skin prickled as I recognized some of the symbols. They were the same ones I'd seen on the walls of the precinct's evidence locker last year, scrawled into the wood of an abandoned car found after a triple homicide. No one had been able to explain them then either. The wall pulsed like it was alive, and then slowly it began to crack open. The wall split open with a low, groaning sound, like stone grinding against stone. A thin, black mist seeped out from the widening crack, curling unnaturally in the air. My flashlight began to flicker violently, and I knew it was about to die. I backed up a step, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the opening. It revealed a narrow tunnel, just big enough for someone to crawl through. The mist was thicker now, coating the floor like an unnatural fog. From the depths of the tunnel came the faintest sound, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails clicking against stone. It grew louder, more frantic, and then I heard it, whispering. Dozens of voices, overlapping in a haunting symphony of despair. "Turn back," one voice hissed. "Stay," another growled. "See," whispered a third. I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, torn between every primal instinct to flee and an unnatural pull to step closer. Then, something moved in the darkness of the tunnel. A hand. It emerged slowly, pale and withered, the fingers impossibly long and tipped with jagged nails. It reached out, clawing at the edge of the opening, and then another hand appeared, followed by the top of a head. The figure dragged itself forward, its movements unnatural and insect-like. His face, I'll never forget that face. It was the same face I'd seen in the corner earlier, only now its hollow eyes were filled with a sickening glow, and its mouth stretched open in a permanent silent scream. "Stop!" I shouted, raising my gun. "I'll shoot." The thing froze, its head tilting to one side like it was listening, and then it smiled. A grotesque, toothless grin that sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could react, it lunged at me with inhuman speed. I fired, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space, but the figure dissolved into the mist before the bullet reached it. The basement erupted into chaos. The whispers turned to screams, and the walls seemed to pulse and shift, the symbols glowing faintly. The mist thickened, swirling around me, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight finally dying. I was plunged into darkness, the air thick with the sound of footsteps and laughter that wasn't my own. Then I felt it, cold, bony fingers brushing against my shoulder. The fingers on my shoulder tightened, freezing me in place. My mind screamed for me to move, but my body refused to obey. The icy grip seeped through my jacket, chilling me to the bone. I swung my arm wildly, aiming to break free, but the mist around me thickened, slowing my movements as if I were underwater. And then the voice returned, louder this time, rasping directly in my ear. "You came, just like they all do." The words were followed by a low, guttural laugh that seemed to echo in my skull. I spun around, gun raised, but there was nothing there. The mist began to shift and swirl, forming shapes, faces, distorted and grotesque, screaming silently as they floated around me. I stumbled back, my heel catching on something, and I fell hard onto the damp concrete floor. My gun skittered away into the darkness. As I scrambled to retrieve it, I realized what had tripped me. A body. It was fresh, the eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. The mouth was twisted into a scream, but there were no wounds, no blood, no signs of violence. I couldn't tell how they had died, but the face was eerily familiar. My stomach churned as recognition set in. It was one of my colleagues, Officer Daniels. Daniels had gone missing 6 months ago while responding to a call in this very neighborhood. His disappearance had been a mystery. Now here he was, lifeless and trapped in this hellish basement. The mist began to close in, pressing against me like a living thing. The whispers turned to screams again, louder and louder, until they drowned out every rational thought. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, a deafening cacophony of agony and rage. And then I saw it, the figure or maybe figures emerging from the mist. They were no longer singular entities but a mass of writhing limbs and distorted faces, shifting and merging into each other like a living nightmare. The mass moved closer, the air growing colder with every inch. I backed away, crawling on my hands and knees, my eyes darting around for my gun. The mist seemed to sense my desperation, parting just enough to reveal it lying a few feet away. I lunged for it, my fingers brushing the grip, when the mist surged forward and engulfed me. The mist wrapped around me like icy tendrils, coiling tighter with every passing second. My lungs burned as the cold seeped into my chest, and the screams in my head were deafening now. A mix of guttural cries and distorted voices that felt like they were tearing my mind apart. My fingers finally closed around the gun, and with a surge of adrenaline, I fired blindly into the swirling darkness. The sound of the shots echoed off the walls, but it didn't seem to faze whatever was in the mist. If anything, the screams only grew louder, angrier, as if the entity was mocking my feeble attempt to fight back. Then, just as suddenly as it had surged forward, the mist recoiled. It pulled away from me, retreating toward the tunnel in jagged, unnatural movements. For a moment, I thought I was safe. I struggled to my feet, gasping for air, and trained my flashlight on the retreating mass. That's when I saw them. Dozens of faces, twisted in agony, pressing against the surface of the mist. Their mouths opened and closed in silent screams, their eyes pleading as they looked directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over Daniel's body again. The mist hovered for a moment at the entrance to the tunnel, as if deciding what to do next. Then it spoke. "You cannot escape." The voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was inside me, reverberating in my bones. My hands shook as I raised the gun again, but before I could fire, the mist surged into the tunnel, disappearing into the darkness. Silence fell over the basement, but it was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It felt heavy, oppressive, as if the air itself was waiting for something. I stumbled toward the stairs, my legs trembling with every step. All I could think about was getting out of that house. When I finally reached the ground floor, the air felt lighter, but not by much. I slammed the front door behind me and staggered to my patrol car. My hands were still shaking as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get away from that place. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the house one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows, a shadowy figure watching me. But I didn't stick around to find out. I sped back to the precinct, my mind racing. I needed to tell someone, to warn them about what I'd seen. But when I pulled into the station parking lot, something was off. The building was dark, empty. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, and called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. I made my way to the bullpen, and that's when I saw it. The same symbols from the basement, scrawled all over the walls in a sickening crimson shade. My blood turned to ice as I realized they weren't symbols. They were names. My name was among them. And then I heard it. The whispering. The whispering grew louder, circling me like an invisible swarm. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, filling every corner of the station. My legs felt like lead as I backed toward the door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Show yourself." The only response was a low, guttural laugh that made my skin crawl. I turned to run, but the door I just entered was gone. In its place was a blank wall, smeared with more of those crimson symbols. My breath came in shallow gasps as I spun around, desperate for an escape. That's when the lights flickered on. The bullpen was no longer empty. Every desk was occupied, but the officers sitting there weren't moving. They were slumped over their chairs, their heads twisted at unnatural angles. Blood pooled beneath them, soaking into the worn carpet. My stomach churned as I recognized their faces. Every single one was a colleague I'd worked with, people who were alive just hours ago. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. "This isn't real." But the scene refused to change. The whispers intensified, merging into a single, disembodied voice that echoed through the room. "You brought it back," it said. "You opened the door. What are you talking about?" I screamed. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the bodies at the desks began to stir. Slowly, unnaturally, they lifted their heads, their dead eyes locking onto me. Their mouths moved in unison, though the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a guttural, distorted noise, like static mixed with a low growl. I stumbled back, my hand fumbling for my gun. The closest body, a rookie I'd mentored just last week, stood and took a halting step toward me. His neck was bent at a grotesque angle, the bone clearly broken, but he moved as if the injury didn't exist. I fired. The bullet hit him square in the chest, but he didn't even flinch. The others began to rise, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, like puppets being controlled by an unseen hand. Panicked, I turned and ran, bolting down the nearest hallway. The building seemed to stretch and twist around me, the walls warping like a funhouse. Every door I tried was locked, and the whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. Finally, I found myself in the evidence room. I slammed the door shut behind me, shoving a heavy filing cabinet in front of it. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. That's when I saw it. A box labeled Ridgewood. It was sitting on one of the shelves, almost glowing in the dim light. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single VHS tape, along with a folder full of old photographs. The pictures showed the same symbols I'd seen in the basement and around the station, scrawled on walls, trees, and even people's skin. One photo in particular made my blood run cold. It was of the house on Ridgewood Avenue, but in the window there was a figure, the same figure I'd seen in the basement. Before I could process what I was seeing, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The door to the evidence room rattled violently, and the lights began to flicker. I grabbed the VHS tape and backed into a corner, my gun raised. The door burst open, and the mist flooded in. The mist poured into the room, thick and choking, swallowing the light until the evidence room was plunged into near-total darkness. I clutched the VHS tape in one hand and my gun in the other, my heart hammering in my chest. The mist coiled and swirled, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Hands, faces, and something larger, something that seemed to tower over me, even in the confined space. I fired into the mist, again and again. The shots echoed, but they didn't seem to hit anything. The mist absorbed the sound, growing denser with each bullet wasted. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. The mist began to pull back, curling toward the far corner of the room. I followed its movement, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood there, half hidden by the mist. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness. In its hand, it held a jagged, rusted blade. It stepped forward, the mist clinging to its body like a living shroud. With each step, the room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. I raised my gun, my hands trembling. "Stay back," I shouted. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figure didn't stop. It reached the center of the room and stood there, unmoving, its hollow eyes locked on mine. And then it spoke, its voice a distorted chorus of pain and malice. "You shouldn't have come here. You've seen too much." The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing with a sickly red light. The air was alive with energy, crackling and buzzing. The figure raised its free hand, and the mist surged forward like a tidal wave. It hit me with the force of a hurricane, knocking me off my feet and slamming me into the wall. I tried to scream, but the mist filled my mouth and nose, suffocating me. My vision blurred, the room spinning wildly. I felt myself being lifted, dragged toward the center of the room, where the figure waited. Through the haze, I saw the VHS tape lying on the ground, just out of reach. It was glowing faintly, the same way the symbols on the walls were. Desperate, I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the plastic. The mist tightened around me, pulling me back, but I forced myself to grab the tape. The moment my hand closed around it, the room exploded with light. The symbols flared brightly, and the figure let out an inhuman scream, its form twisting and distorting. The mist recoiled, pulling away from me, and the pressure in the air lifted. I didn't hesitate. Clutching the tape, I bolted out of the room, down the warped hallway, and back into the bullpen. The bodies of my colleagues were gone, the room eerily quiet. The front door was back in place, and I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air. I never went back to the house on Ridgewood Avenue, and I never spoke of what happened that night to anyone. The tape is locked away in a secure place, and I haven't dared to watch it. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear the whispers. They come to me in dreams, calling my name, telling me to return. And the worst part? Every now and then, when I'm driving through town late at night, I see the mist, curling around streetlights, creeping through alleyways, still out there, waiting, watching, for someone else to open the door. I thought I could leave it all behind. After that night, I transferred to a quieter precinct in another state, hoping distance would keep whatever I'd encountered at Ridgewood from finding me. For months, it worked. The whispers stopped, the dreams faded, and life returned to a fragile semblance of normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. One night, as I sat in my apartment reviewing old case files, I noticed something strange. The name Ridgewood appeared on a report I'd never seen before, an unrelated case from a small town hundreds of miles away. It was listed as a missing persons location, dated just 2 weeks ago. I stared at the report, my pulse quickening. It was impossible. Ridgewood Avenue wasn't in this state, and yet here it was. I pulled up the address on my phone. The house in the photo was unmistakable. The same broken windows, the same sagging porch. It was the house. My phone buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. An unknown number. Hello, I answered, my voice shaky. The line crackled with static before a familiar voice spoke. It was Daniel's. You left the door open, he whispered. The line went dead. I dropped the phone, cold sweat breaking out across my skin. Daniels was dead. He'd been dead for over a year. My mind raced as I pieced together the fragments of that night. The symbols, the mist, the tape. I thought I'd escaped, but it had followed me. Or maybe I'd brought it with me. That night, the dreams returned. They were worse than ever, vivid and suffocating. I was back in the basement, the mist pressing in on me, the whispers louder than ever. And then I saw it again, the figure, standing at the edge of the darkness, its glowing eyes locked on mine. You can't run, it said, its voice echoing in my skull. The door is open, and it's hungry. I woke up screaming, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and the faint smell of damp earth lingered in the air. I reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and went out. In the corner of the room, the mist was waiting. Final revelation: the house on Ridgewood Avenue wasn't just haunted. It was a gateway, a trap designed to feed on fear and suffering. I hadn't escaped that night. I'd become part of it. Wherever I went, the mist would follow, spreading like a virus, claiming more victims. And now, as I write this, I can hear the whispers again, closer this time. I don't know how much longer I have, but if you're reading this, I need you to promise me one thing. If you ever find yourself on a street called Ridgewood Avenue, no matter where you are, don't go inside the house. Don't even look at it. Turn around and walk away. Because once you open the door, it never closes. The mist wasn't waiting this time, it was moving. It spilled from the corner like a living thing, curling along the floor, climbing the walls, filling every inch of the room. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the headboard, clutching the VHS tape like it was a lifeline. The air was electric, buzzing with a sinister energy, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. You can't run, the voices hissed. You can't hide. The mist thickened, and through its swirling mass, the figure emerged. His body seemed to shift and flicker, like a broken signal on an old TV. Its hollow eyes burned with that sickly glow, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that dripped malice. "This ends tonight," it said, its voice a cacophony of pain and fury. I knew it wasn't just talking to me. It was talking about me. I was part of this now, tied to the house, to the door, to whatever dark force had been unleashed. The mist surged forward, enveloping the room in total darkness, and I felt its cold, bony fingers clawing at my skin, pulling me down. But then, something clicked. The tape, the symbols, the glowing marks, the names, they all pointed to the same thing. The VHS tape wasn't just a record of what had happened. It was a key, a way to fight back, a way to close the door. My hands fumbled as I grabbed the old portable TV from the corner of the room and jammed the tape into the player. The TV buzzed to life, the static crackling like thunder. The moment the tape began to play, the mist recoiled. The screen flickered, showing rapid cuts of the house, the basement, the glowing symbols, and then the faces. All the faces of the victims, their mouths moving silently as they stared into the camera. The mist howled, the sound inhuman and furious. The figure lunged at me, its claws inches from my face, but the symbols on the tape began to glow brighter, their light spilling out of the screen and burning into the mist. The faces on the tape chanted in unison, their silent cries merging into a single word that echoed through the room. Close. The light exploded outward, a blinding flash that burned through the mist and tore the figure apart. Its body twisted and writhed, disintegrating into ash as the light consumed it. The mist screamed one final time before vanishing completely, sucked back into the void from which it came. The room went silent. I sat there in the aftermath, trembling, my ears ringing and my vision blurred. The VHS tape had stopped, the screen now a blank, empty void. The symbols on the walls had disappeared, leaving nothing but bare, cracked paint. For the first time in over a year, the air felt still. It was over. Epilogue: I burned the tape the next day, along with every piece of evidence I had. I resigned from the force and left the state, this time for good. Ridgewood Avenue was condemned. The house bulldozed into rubble, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. The door was closed, but there are always other doors. Sometimes, late at night, I feel a chill in the air or catch a faint whisper on the wind. Maybe it's just my imagination, the scars of what I've been through. Or maybe the house isn't done with me. If you ever hear the whispers or feel the cold touch of the mist, run. Don't look back. Don't open the door, because once you do, there's no coming back.
My name is Jessica. I always thought I lived in a safe world where the worst thing that could happen was a broken nail plate or a missed bus. My story began when I moved to the small town of Brockton. The town seemed like the perfect place to start a new life. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, perfect homes. But I had no idea that something terrible was hiding behind this idol. It was the day I moved into my new house, an old two-story cottage, cozy and furnished with antique furniture. It looks like an ideal place for a quiet life. The first suspicious thing was that the neighbors avoided direct contact with me. They greeted each other politely, but quickly looked away and hurried on their way. I chalked it up to their shyness and didn't pay much attention, but at night, everything changed. I woke up to a strange sound, similar to the grinding of metal. It was coming from the basement. I broke out in a cold sweat, but I decided it was just my imagination and went back to bed. The next night, the sound came again, but this time it was clearer and much closer. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Taking a knife for self-defense from the kitchen, I slowly went down the stairs. The light in the basement wasn't working, so I turned on the flashlight on my phone. The screeching continued, but now it was accompanied by a soft whisper. I opened the basement door and saw something that made my hair stand on end. In the corner, tied to a chair, sat a girl. She looked exhausted and beaten, her clothes covered in blood. She raised her eyes at me, full of fear and pain. I realized that this was not an accident, it was planned, and I was now involved in this horror. It was just the beginning. Little did I know that Brockton was home to a serial killer, and now I was his next target. I stood there, paralyzed with terror, unable to believe my eyes. The girl was looking at me, her lips were moving, but no sound reached my ears. I slowly came closer, trying not to make too much noise. Her voice was weak, barely audible. "Help," she whispered. I quickly looked around for any tool or means that could help her free herself. Suddenly, I heard footsteps upstairs. My heart beat faster. I realized that the killer was coming back. There was no time to think. "You should be quiet," I whispered, pulling a knife from my belt. "I'll come back for you." She nodded, and I quickly made my way back up to the first floor, trying not to make any noise. I jumped into a closet in the hallway, hoping I wouldn't be found. The footsteps came closer, and I held my breath. The man entered the house, muttering something under his breath. I couldn't see his face through the gaps in the closet, but he looked big and dangerous. He passed the closet and went down to the basement. After a few seconds, I heard her screams, full of despair and pain. I knew that I could not remain inactive. I came out of my hiding place and started looking for my phone to call the police. But my phone was in the bedroom on the second floor. Each step up seemed like an eternity. When I finally reached my room, I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed 911. "Brockton Police, how can I help you?" answered the operator. "I need help. There's a serial killer in my house. There's a girl in the basement. He's with her now. Please send someone immediately," I whispered, trying not to give away my location. "We are sending a patrol to your address. Stay in touch and try to find a safe place," the operator said. I heard the basement door open again. The man was returning. I quickly hid under the bed, holding my breath. He entered the room and I saw his feet. He stopped, then began to look around the room. I realized that my life now depended on whether I managed to remain unnoticed until the police arrived. I was lying under the bed, trying not to breathe, listening to the steps of the killer, who were getting closer to me. He muttered something under his breath as he looked around the room. I saw his legs moving, searching for something, and my heart was pounding in my chest as if it might explode at any moment. Finally, he stopped at the door, taking a deep breath. I thought he let out a disappointed sigh and then began to slowly make his way back down the stairs. I stayed under the bed for a few more minutes, waiting until I heard the sound of police sirens. Time dragged on for an unbearably long time, but in the end, I heard the long-awaited sound. Police sirens pierced the silence of the night, and I felt some of the tension leave my body. I carefully crawled out from under the bed and rushed to the window to signal the police. When I opened the window, I panicked. The police were still on the road, and the killer could hear them approaching. I quickly ran out of the room and started to go downstairs, but suddenly stopped halfway. The basement was open, and I heard his footsteps quickly approaching the stairs. They are already here, I thought. I have to find a safe place. I ran out into the backyard and hid behind the bushes, praying the killer wouldn't see me. Police cars pulled up in front of the house, and I heard the officers yelling orders. They entered the house, and I heard shots. Everything mixed into one chaotic noise. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the police officers found me. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping me up. "There's a girl in the basement," I said, trying to hold back tears. "He's holding her hostage." The policeman nodded and signaled to his colleagues. They quickly entered the house and found the girl. She was alive but badly injured. She was immediately sent to the hospital. The murderer was arrested, but the feeling of fear did not leave me. I knew that this night would leave its mark on my life forever. I had witnessed true evil, and now I would have to live with that knowledge. After that terrible night, I returned to my house, trying to recover from what I had experienced. The police left him, but the fear remained. Every sound, every shadow made me shudder. I tried to find the strength to trust people again and live a normal life, but it was difficult. One day, a few weeks later, I decided to visit the hospital where the rescued girl was. Her name was Emily, and she looked a little better than when I first saw her. She was grateful that I had saved her, but I knew that she too would never forget what had happened. "How are you?" I asked, sitting next to her bed. "Better," she replied, trying to smile, "but it's still hard to sleep at night." "I know how you feel," I said. "It's hard for me too, but we have to stick together and help each other." Emily nodded, and we started talking about everything that happened. She told me more about the killer, how he kidnapped his victims and kept them in the basement before harming them. I felt chills on my skin listening to these terrible stories. "But you know what's worst?" she continued, looking straight into my eyes. "I was not his first victim, and, I'm afraid, not the last." These words made me think. The killer was arrested, but what if there were others working with him? What if this was just the beginning? I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. I needed to act. I decided I had to find out more about the killer and his possible accomplices. It meant going back to where it all began, the house where I found Emily. I knew it would be dangerous, but there was no other way out. I started my investigation from local archives and newspapers. Brockton had a long history, and I was hoping to find some clues about murders or disappearances that might be related to our case. The archivist, a local old man named Henry, was very helpful. He walked me through the mountains of documents, and we began to search. A few days later, I came across a series of articles that seemed suspicious to me. They talked about the disappearances of young women that had occurred in Brockton over the past 10 years. All these women disappeared without a trace, and no trace or suspect was ever found. This can't be a coincidence, I thought. Something is wrong here. I decided to talk to the families of the missing women to find out more. They might know something that wasn't mentioned in the articles. First on the list was the family of Maria Jenkins, who disappeared 5 years ago. Her parents still lived in the same house, and I went to live with them. Mrs. Jenkins opened the door. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from tears. She invited me inside, and we sat down in the living room. I explained who I was and why I came. "Maria was a beautiful girl," said Mrs. Jenkins, wiping away tears. "She would never leave without warning. We know something happened to her." "Did you notice anything suspicious prior to her disappearance?" I asked. "Yes, there was one thing," she replied, looking thoughtfully out the window. "She said someone was watching her. We thought it was just her imagination, but now I'm not sure." This was an important clue. I realized that the killer or his accomplices could have been watching their victims before abducting them. I needed to know more. I continued my investigations by meeting other families and gathering information. Each new detail confirmed my suspicions. There was a group of assassins operating in Brockton, and they were experienced and very careful. But I decided that I would not stop until I exposed them and put an end to this horror. My determination to expose the killers grew stronger after each conversation with the families of the missing women. Every new detail, every little clue confirmed that there was a group of killers operating in the city. I realized that I had to act carefully so as not to become the next victim. The next step was to seek out those who might know more about the activities of the killers in Brockton. I turned to detectives who worked on cases of missing women. One of them was Detective Jonathan Reed. He was already retired but had extensive experience in the police. I found his address and went to his house. He lived on the outskirts of the city, in a small but cozy house. When I knocked on the door, he appeared almost immediately, looking at me suspiciously. "How can I help?" he asked. "Detective Reed, my name is Jane. I'm investigating the disappearance of young women in Brockton. Maybe you heard about the recent case with Emily? I rescued her, and now I'm trying to find out if there is a connection between these disappearances." He listened carefully to me, then invited me inside. We sat down in the kitchen, and I began to tell him everything I had learned. "You are very brave," he said when I finished. "But you should know that it is extremely dangerous." "I understand, but I can't just sit back," I replied. "I must find them and stop them." He sighed and nodded. "Okay, I'll help you. I have some old files and contacts that might be useful, but promise to be careful." I agreed, and he started sharing information with me. It turned out that there were suspicions about the existence of a secret organization that kidnapped and killed women. They acted carefully, leaving a minimum of traces. "We believe they had informants in town," Detective Reed said. "This may explain why they always knew when the police were approaching." This was an important clue. I realized that I should be especially careful who I trust. I decided to go back to the house where I found Emily and investigate further. Maybe I missed some clues or hints. I returned to the house where I found Emily, feeling anxious again. This place was abandoned, but I knew there might be important clues left here. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were boarded up. I carefully entered inside, looking around. The house looked just as awful as it had in my memory. The basement was still open, and I felt a chill on my skin again. I went downstairs, lighting the way with a flashlight. The basement was dark and damp, and I tried not to focus on the horrible memories. I began scanning the room for any clues that might lead me to the killers. There were various tools on the walls, but nothing suspicious. Then I noticed a small door in the corner that I hadn't noticed before. It was half open, and behind it a staircase could be seen going down. I gathered all my courage and went down the stairs. It was another basement, even deeper and darker. I saw an old table with papers and photos on it. They were terrible. Photographs of women bound and immobilized, their faces full of fear. Emily was among them. I quickly took pictures of the evidence on my phone, trying not to touch anything. I knew it could be important to the police. Then I noticed a list of names on one of the sheets. These were the names of women I already knew and a few more I hadn't heard of. Suddenly, I heard footsteps upstairs. Someone entered the house. My heart froze, and I realized that I had to hide. I turned off the flashlight and lay down under the table, trying to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps were approaching. I heard someone coming down the stairs. My breathing became fast, and I prayed that I wouldn't be found. The killer looked around the room, and I saw his feet very close. He stopped at the table, and I felt sweat form on my forehead. "What are you doing here?" I heard his voice, and I was overcome with horror. My heart stopped when I heard his voice. I was sure that he would find me, but suddenly he retreated. Footsteps began to recede, and I heard him climbing the stairs. It wasn't until I heard the front door close that I finally dared to exhale. I stayed under the table for a few more minutes, trying to calm down. Then, sure that the killer was gone, I got out of hiding and quickly left the basement. I knew I had strong evidence and needed to notify the police immediately. I quickly ran to my car and drove to the police station. All the way, I was afraid that the killer could track me down. When I arrived, I was met by the officer on duty, to whom I immediately showed the photos and the list of names I had found. They quickly called together a team of detectives, and I was invited into the interrogation room, where I told everything I saw and found. Among the detectives was Jonathan Reed. He listened attentively without interrupting. "You did a great job," he said when I finished. "These photos can help us find these people and save other women." The officers immediately went to the house I described. Jonathan stayed with me, and we began to discuss the next steps. He knew that now we had to act quickly to prevent the killers from hiding. The next day, the police organized a large-scale operation to capture the criminals. They collected all possible resources and began raids on possible places of their shelter. I could not sit idly by and decided to help as much as I could. I met Jonathan again. We looked through all the documents we found and tried to find additional clues. The list of names I found was particularly important. He pointed to connections between victims and killers, as well as possible new targets. We discovered that all the women who disappeared were connected to a certain nightclub in the center of the city. It was a popular place for young people, but I would never have thought that it could be associated with such horror. We decided to visit this club to find out more. When we arrived at the club, it was already full of people. The music was playing loudly, and I felt anxious. We started questioning the staff and visitors, but no one noticed anything suspicious. However, one of the barmaids said she saw some of the missing women in the company of men who frequented the club. "They always came together," she said, "and then I didn't see them again." This was important information. We realized that the killers used the club to find their victims. Jonathan decided to stay and continue the investigation, while I went home to rest and collect my thoughts. When I got home, I felt exhausted. My apartment seemed safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked and tried to get some sleep. Sleep came hard, and I woke up at every sound. In the middle of the night, I heard someone softly knocking on the door. My heart beat faster. I went to the door and asked, "Who is there?" "This is Jonathan," said a familiar voice. I sighed with relief and opened the door. "I thought you might be in danger," he said as he walked inside. "I found something important in the club, and I want you to see it." He unfolded a piece of paper with an address on it. "This is a warehouse where they can keep the women. We should go there immediately." I agreed, and we quickly drove to the specified place. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of the city, in a remote area. When we arrived, I felt a strong tension. We cautiously approached the building and heard sounds inside. Jonathan and I decided not to wait for reinforcements and entered on our own. It was dark and quiet inside, but we could hear muffled voices. I was ready for any turn of events. We carefully moved through the dark corridors of the warehouse, lighting the way with flashlights. The sounds were getting louder, and we realized that we were getting closer to the source. My heart was beating wildly, and there was a lump in my throat. Every step was difficult, but I knew we had to go on. Finally, we reached the large room where the voices were coming from. We looked inside and saw several men standing by a table discussing something. Behind them, we saw the cages in which the women were locked. Their faces were pale and frightened. "We must act quickly," Jonathan whispered. "I'll try to divert their attention and you free the women." I nodded, realizing that there was no time to think. Jonathan entered the room, attracting the attention of the men. I quickly made my way to the cages and started looking for the keys. Finding them, I began to unlock the locks, freeing the women one by one. One of the men noticed me and started shouting. I realized that we had little time and hurried to free the last woman. At that moment, Jonathan collided with the man, trying to buy us a few seconds. "Run!" I shouted to the women, and they rushed to the exit. I came back to help Jonathan. We struggled together with the men, trying to hold on. Suddenly, one of them took out a knife and rushed at me. I backed away, but he grabbed my arm. The pain was unbearable, but I gathered all my strength and pushed him away. At this time, Jonathan neutralized another attacker. We broke out of the building and saw that reinforcements had already arrived. The police surrounded the warehouse, detaining all the suspects. The women were saved, and I felt relieved, even though I knew this was just the beginning of the fight. After that night, events began to unfold rapidly. The police arrested several suspects, but we knew that this was only the tip of the iceberg. Jonathan and I continued to investigate, trying to find everyone involved in this network. We discovered that the organization had deep roots in the city and had been active for many years. Each new fact only strengthened our desire to bring the matter to an end. The women we rescued were willing to help by testifying and sharing their experiences. Jonathan invited me to his apartment to discuss the next steps. We sat at the table looking at the collected documents and planning our actions. I felt that we were on the right path, but at the same time, I knew that danger still loomed over us. "We have to be careful," Jonathan said as we discussed the plan. "This organization has influential friends, and they can strike at us at any moment." "I understand," I answered, "but we have to stop them. They cannot go unpunished." We worked through the night preparing for the next phase of the investigation. As dawn peeked through the windows, I felt tired but also determined. I knew I wasn't going to stop until I got the job done. The next day, we went to see one of the suspects, who was the owner of a nightclub. We knew he could be a key figure in the organization, and we intended to get as much information from him as possible. We arrived at his house early in the morning. It was a large, luxurious mansion surrounded by a high fence. Jonathan knocked on the door, and we waited for it to be opened. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man appeared, dressed in an expensive suit. "How can I help?" he asked, looking at us suspiciously. "We want to talk to you about your club's activities," Jonathan said. "We have some questions you could answer." The man reluctantly invited us inside. We sat down in the living room, and I felt the tension rise. Jonathan began asking questions about his connections with the suspects and the activities of the club. The man refused to answer at first, but then he realized that we know more than we think. "Okay," he finally said. "I will tell you everything I know, but you must promise to protect me." We agreed, and he began to tell. It turned out that the club was just a front for their activities. They kidnapped women who came there and sold them into slavery. He gave us the names of other members of the organization and the addresses of their hiding places. This information was extremely valuable. We thanked him and immediately left for the police to hand over all the evidence we had collected. Jonathan knew that we now had enough information to launch a massive operation against this organization. The police immediately launched an operation to arrest the suspects at the addresses we provided. It was a large-scale operation that required the coordination of many units. Jonathan and I were at the center of events, following the development of the situation. I could not get rid of the anxious feeling. Are we missing something important? Will we have time to save everyone who is being held captive? These thoughts did not give me peace, but I knew that we must continue the fight. The first objects were captured without any particular problems. Police broke into houses and warehouses, detaining suspects and freeing victims. However, one of the addresses turned out to be empty, which made us nervous. They could have learned about our plans, Jonathan said. We must be ready for any development of events. Finally, we reached the last object, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This was the place where, according to our informant, the most women were kept. When we arrived, we were met by armed men guarding the building. The police surrounded the warehouse, preparing for an assault. Jonathan and I also joined in, ready to help. The sound of gunshots and screams filled the air as we stormed inside. It was clear that this place was a real stronghold of criminals. Chaos reigned inside the warehouse. The police and the guards of the criminals fought for every meter of space. I saw some of our men fall, wounded or killed. It was hell on earth, but we couldn't back down. Jonathan and I made our way forward, looking for women. In the dark corners of the warehouse, we found locked rooms where they were kept. Their faces were pale and scared, but there was also hope in their eyes. "We came to save you," I said, opening one of the doors. Women rushed to us, crying and thanking. We took them outside, where they were met by doctors and policemen. The battle continued for some time, but in the end we were able to capture the warehouse. All criminals were either detained or destroyed. It was a great victory, but I knew the fight was not over. After the operation, we returned to the police station where all the participants gathered. I saw the tired but satisfied faces of the policemen and doctors. We knew that we had saved many lives, but we also knew that there was still a lot of work to be done. The police chief thanked us for our work and noted that we had taken an important step in the fight against this organization. Jonathan and I received official thanks, but the greatest reward for us was seeing the rescued women who were now able to return to their families. After the meeting, Jonathan and I decided to rest for a while. We went to a coffee shop nearby and ordered coffee. Sitting around the table, we discussed our next steps. "It was hard, but we did it," Jonathan said, smiling. "We saved many lives today." "Yes," I answered, feeling relieved. "But we must continue. This organization is not destroyed yet, and we must find everyone involved." We spent the next few days analyzing the collected information and planning further actions. The police arrested many suspects, and we hoped they would provide new evidence to help us expand our investigation. One evening, when we were getting ready to finish our work, one of the detectives approached us. He had a worried look on his face. "You should see this," he said, handing us a folder of documents. We opened it and saw pictures taken at the club where it all started. One of them depicted a man whom we did not recognize. "Who is this?" I asked, looking at the detective. "This is one of the leaders of the organization," he answered. "We found these photos on the computer of one of the suspects. He works under different names and has always evaded arrest. We realized that we had a real enemy in front of us and decided to immediately start the search. He was the most dangerous and cunning of all that we had pursued, and we knew that we were in for a serious fight. Our new enemy was cunning and dangerous. We began to gather information about his past and learned that he used several different names and lived a lavish lifestyle, hiding his true intentions. His real name was Michael Raines. Jonathan and I decided to act quickly. After gathering all possible information about his whereabouts, we set out for his last known address. It was a huge, luxurious villa on the outskirts of the city. When we arrived, we were greeted by closed gates and security. We introduced ourselves and said we had a search warrant. The guards reluctantly let us in. It was quiet and peaceful inside the villa, like a trap waiting for its victims. We split up, searching each room for Michael. I was studying the spacious living room when I heard a noise from the next room. There was Jonathan, who found the hidden entrance to the basement. We went down there carefully, knowing that Michael might be armed. The basement was dark and damp, like a labyrinth with many rooms and corridors. We moved forward, relying on the weak light of the lanterns. Time seemed to drag on forever as we searched for our enemy. Suddenly, we heard screams. We ran to the sound and found the room where Michael was holding the women captive. They were tied up and scared. We immediately cut their ropes and set them free. "Michael is here somewhere," said one of the women, trembling with fear. "He said he wouldn't let us escape." We knew we had to act fast. We brought the women to the surface, where they were met by the police and medics. Then they went back to the basement to find Michael. We finally found him deep in the basement in a room that had been set up as his personal retreat. Michael sat at the table, smiling. "Do you think you won?" he said without getting up. "You are just pawns in my game." "Game over, Michael," I replied. "You are under arrest." He suddenly jumped out with his gun drawn, but Jonathan was faster. A shot rang out and Michael fell, wounded but alive. We immediately handcuffed him and brought him to the surface. This day was a victory for us, but I knew that our journey was not over yet. We saved many women and apprehended a dangerous criminal, but the organization he led still existed. I looked at Jonathan, who was standing next to me, tired but satisfied. We took a big step forward, and I knew that together we could continue this fight. "This is just the beginning," I said, looking at the sunset. "We will continue." Jonathan nodded, and we went back to work preparing for new challenges and victories.